The following is a look at the killers of Dead by Daylight, and any real-world equivalents they might have. Let's continue. The Drawny, aka the Dredge. A radical departure from anything we've seen before. This is the first of only 2 original killers that can't be considered human. Although that's 3 now, with the inclusion of the Unknown, and 2 licensed ones. And probably Pyramid Head and Nemesis. Maybe Myers. Wesker and Blight used to be human. You know what? Screw it. You're not special, Dredge. But the Dredge has never been human. It has no gender, no personality. So what is it? Well, we'll need to look at a group of folk before we begin. It's a cult called The Fold, set up on a private island in North America called Withered Isles. Sounds charming. At least the main compound was called the Garden of Joy, doubly ironic for anyone who plays killer, but still. Whenever a cult is mentioned, we automatically think of the leader and wonder what their goals are. One Otto Stamper was the leader, described as charismatic because, well, all cult leaders have that psychopathic charm. They wouldn't reach their position if they didn't. But from reading the base lore, I get the impression that life on the island was actually quite nice, at least for a while. Not so bad for an authoritarian society with a growing streak of paranoia. This suspicion reached a chilling level when members of the Fold started disappearing in their sleep. Stamper told his flock that something awful had come to their paradise, the Drawny. By this point, I assume the Fold members were in too deep into the cult's way of thinking. Small sacrifices build up over the years, little transgressions are overlooked by the desperate and miserable, in exchange for the promise of something nice. But now begins a period of isolation and sleep deprivation. They are being broken down. Then a new character was introduced, a prisoner and journalist. At least, Stamper said she was a journalist, we don't know for sure. While detained on a rainy beach, she tried to tell the congregation that Stamper was part of an ancient and sadistic cult that would sacrifice them all to an evil god. Stamper then slit her throat. Maybe he should have gagged her in the first place. Stamper told the Fold that she was working with others amongst them, and they needed to find the traitors before the Drawny came for them all. Having witnessed bloodshed and their mental states at breaking points, the Fold then tore itself apart. A collective madness and pain possessed them all. I imagine they couldn't help themselves as suppressed emotion exploded onto them. Otto Stamper stood back and watched with cold eyes as the violence unleashed on that rainy beach. Presumably most of the Fold was dead by this point, and crows began circling above. Then a collective growth of sludge manifested and fed upon the bodies and the pain that was caused. I think it formed using the bodies on the beach. There's a tremendous emphasis on sound, screams, cries, cracks, anything dreadful you can imagine. The cult essentially willed this thing into existence, and when it was done feeding, it exchanged a look with the former leader, then disappeared, presumably to start its new work in the fog, under the name The Dredge. The character of Otto Stamper might sound familiar. He was the mentor of the Doctor, and then killed in his lore. Presumably the Fold was Stamper's project before he moved on to Larry's Memorial Institute. His followers were called Automarians, which frankly sounds ridiculous. Perhaps they were named by whoever came up with the VAC label. Alright, I promise I won't go on about that anymore. Anyway, when we look at real-world cults, there are plenty to choose from and draw parallels to, but all of them feel too different from anything in this lore. But to be fair, in this universe, there really is an evil demigod that will destroy everything. Real-life cults were a load of nonsense, and often deadly nonsense. David Berg, of the Children of God, is the first of our megalomaniacs, but as far as I know wasn't responsible for any deaths. His misery was the most common amongst cult leaders, an obsession with sex, and this obsession extended to children. DBD won't touch sexuality, much less towards kids. There are certain lines they won't cross. David Koresh of the Branch Davidians went the same direction. Women of the compound bore his children, at least 16, and I can't begin to imagine what the husbands of these women were thinking. A cult really does absorb your entire life. And after the infamous Waco siege, about 80 people died in fire or by suicide after a 51-day standoff. Shoko Asahara of Aum Shinrikyo were also critical of government and wanted power for themselves. Unlike some of the other cults, Aum Shinrikyo stayed in wider society and became very accomplished for a cult. They had resources and connections and wide influence, and they had access to chemicals. They were ultimately responsible for the Tokyo sarin gas attacks, which murdered 8 people and injured over 500. Aum Shinrikyo were one of the few cults that targeted people outside itself. But perhaps the most infamous cult was also responsible for killing people outside itself, led by Charles Manson of the Manson family, but this case is such a huge mess of hearsay, confusion, lies, a full-blown media circus. The family was responsible for 9 to 24 murders, but the details are problematic. I think one needs to do extensive research in this case, and I simply don't have the time, and I don't feel it's terribly relevant. The comparatively obscure Roque Thoreau of the Ant Hill Kids were much more isolationist, and embarked upon similar communal living we see in The Fold. He was also more of a typical sex fiend that fathered 26 children with the women in the commune. The treatment of the people on the farm was beyond abusive and into the realm of torturous, and several people died. Marshall Applewhite of Heaven's Gate supposedly wasn't as motivated by lust as many of the others, but the same collective madness possessed the group and 39 people died in a mass suicide. But this case is the most curious. It doesn't strike me as overtly abusive or controlling, and what exactly went on with them is still a mystery to me. Perhaps the most similar event to what happened on Withered Isles is the most dreadful cult catastrophe, Jim Jones of the People's Temple, which resulted in nearly 1,000 people being murdered in what was ostensibly a mass suicide. Jones had taken his followers to Guana in 1974, and the farm and commune was also a bad place to live, authoritarian, with scarce resources. But the people had been broken and worn down until a fateful day when the government would come after them. Let me share some thoughts on contempt. There's an egoist malignancy to have a special hatred for people you deem stupid. Maybe you don't understand why the cult members did what they did. I struggle with it myself, but to just dismiss the followers as idiots is a bit too easy. We have hindsight, they don't. Let's be kind to them. But imagine the contempt the leaders had for the very people that followed them. Like a snake oil salesman who sees his customers as suckers, but much more deadly. A psychopathic and narcissistic contempt at the sheer stupidity of those they pretend to love. The Fold were actually less scary than the real-world equivalents. There is a goal-oriented mission, however perverse. But real life doesn't follow a narrative. There's only death. There are many other cults I could explore, but I have another case I'd like to draw comparisons from. Joseph de Mambro of the Order of the Solar Temple. Based in Switzerland in 1984, the group was ultimately responsible for 77 deaths, some suicide, some murder. I'm going to have to skip over quite a lot as I already have done, but they killed a baby and her parents believing the baby to be the Antichrist, and after many setbacks and violent outbursts the Order began a process to weed out traitors. That aspect of paranoia was missing from the other cults, but we see it clearly in The Fold. Dozens of people were collectively burned in fires, others were shot or suffocated with plastic bags or poisoned in various places in Switzerland or France. This kind of violence is more akin to what we saw in the law, but this is another case that's so complicated I'll need a few weeks to really go over the details. But what I see is the grim inspiration for a story that takes parts of all these cases. And that's a good description of the Dredge. It took parts of them all. This is perhaps the most upsetting lore in Dead by Daylight, and I commend the team for showing a, dare I say, steadfast commitment to horror, and a willingness to show their teeth. No, DBD isn't as scary as it used to be, But some of those at the top are still committed to keeping survival horror in the IP's blood. But did the cult have to be named The Fold on Withered Isle? Cults don't normally market how evil they innately are. I think Otto Stamper could have taken a lesson from one more cult. They're called Love Has Won. See, this is how you brand your insane power trip. What a lovely notion that answers a question we're all asking. Love has won. These people have never played Dead by Daylight. They were led by one Amy Carlson, and she was one cool gal. She claimed she was the reincarnation of Cleopatra, Joan of Arc, Marilyn Monroe, and many other notable historical figures. She was even a reincarnation of Jesus himself. I'm prepared to bet had this movement came about 100 years from now, she claimed to be the reincarnation of Matthew Cote. But that's not all. A slew of dead celebrities were her spiritual ambassadors. Also, she was God, in fact, and had healing powers. Unfortunately, those healing powers didn't stop her from dying of cancer. Her mummified body was found with her followers several weeks after she died. Supposedly, the autopsy didn't rule cause of death as cancer, but anorexia, alcoholism, and colloidal silver abuse. And that's the end of that. I don't mean to make light of an evil cult, but I dearly needed some levity after this one, and that's about as good an ending a cult can have. I wonder if this madness is also a part of the Dredge, a physical manifestation of cults. The DBD community had been asking for a killer that interacted with lockers for a while, and I always felt that was a bad idea. Why would the killer want to go into a locker and wait? Meanwhile, the survivors are doing gens. Thankfully, I was dead wrong. I hadn't thought about using lockers to teleport, and it's great. If you get a good map. All of the Dredge's mechanics are interesting and feel like they should be more competitive than they are. This character carries a certain weight and grittiness to it that other killers only wish they could emulate. But it's undermined by the Dredge's below-average position in tier lists. One problem is this monster is too freaking loud. He's like some kind of evil air conditioner. Can't all static noises be suppressed in Nightfall at least? You already glow in the dark, and good luck mind gaming with a Hoover up your ass. Regardless, I just love this killer. Just like Sadako, actually. Yes, they may not be rubbing shoulders with the nurse, but they are fun and scary. Two things high-ranking players seem to feel is beneath them. Let's try to keep the horror in DBD.